When an arrogant white female cop, believing herself above the law, disrespects a renowned black judge known for his fairness, the courtroom holds its breath. But no one expected his powerful ruling to not only shatter her arrogance, but also change her life forever. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Los Angeles County Courthouse, Monday morning. Sunlight streamed through the large glass windows, illuminating the bustling hallways. The air inside the courthouse was heavy, partly from the constant murmur of whispered conversations, partly from the presence of a figure who was no stranger to controversy. Rebecca Carter. Rebecca was a white female police officer, well known not just for her competence but also for her arrogance. She had dodged trouble numerous times, hiding behind her badge. But this time, things were different. She was charged with reckless driving, running a red light, and nearly hitting an elderly pedestrian, Edward Lopez. The incident had not only injured Mr. Lopez, but also raised serious questions about Rebecca's ethics and professional conduct. The case quickly became the talk of the town, especially since it would be presided over by Judge Marcus Grant, a black man celebrated for his fairness and strict adherence to the principle that everyone is equal before the law. Inside the courtroom, the seats quickly filled. Journalists, lawyers, and onlookers sat in silence, their eyes brimming with curiosity as they awaited Rebecca's arrival. Some hoped she would finally face the consequences of her actions, while others doubted whether her privilege and connections would allow her to escape punishment once again. As the room grew thick with tension, the door creaked open. Rebecca entered, her neatly pressed police uniform catching the light. She carried herself with the demeanor of someone used to being the center of attention. Head held high, her cold gaze sweeping across the room as if no one present was worthy of her notice. Her blonde hair was tightly tied back, her face meticulously made up, and the sound of her polished shoes echoed sharply on the marble floor. Behind her, her attorney hurried to keep up, his face tight with stress. He leaned toward her, whispering, "Rebecca, remember to act professional. This is not the time to show off." But Rebecca merely smirked, a faint, mocking smile. She didn't reply or slow her stride. When she reached the defendant's table, she sat with icy confidence, placing her bag on the polished wooden surface before crossing her arms. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as all eyes focused on her. Moments later, a side door opened and Judge Marcus Grant entered. A tall man with salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed and sharp eyes framed by metal-rimmed glasses, he exuded an air of authority. Despite the courtroom's tension, he moved with calm precision, embodying the weight of justice itself. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out. Everyone stood at attention, everyone except Rebecca, who rose reluctantly, letting out an audible sigh. Her defiance didn't escape Judge Grant's notice, though he chose not to address it. Instead, he gave a slight nod to the bailiff before sitting at the bench, opening the case file, and preparing to commence the trial. His sharp gaze briefly landed on Rebecca, as if measuring the person who now stood before the scales of justice. In that fleeting moment, the room's atmosphere grew heavier, as though everyone could sense that this would not be a typical courtroom proceeding. Rebecca, despite maintaining her outward confidence, couldn't shake an underlying sense of unease. Yet instead of reflecting, she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her gaze indifferent as it rested on the judge. To her, this was just another tedious formality, a routine script she'd seen play out many times before and expected to navigate easily once again. What she didn't know was that today would be unlike any other day. Today, justice would prevail. Rebecca sat in the defendant's chair with an icy demeanor, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as if forming a shield against the scrutiny of the entire courtroom. Her sigh echoed loudly, clearly intentional, ensuring that everyone heard it. In front of her was a dark wooden table, a surface soon to bear the weight of her alleged crimes. Yet Rebecca didn't look at it. Instead, her gaze lazily wandered across the room, as if searching for something more interesting to occupy her attention. Outwardly, she wore the uniform of a police officer, a symbol of authority and duty, but her posture, her attitude, sent an entirely different message: defiance, rebellion. Her meticulously manicured nails tapped rhythmically on the wooden surface, producing soft but provocative clicks that filled the tense silence. From the gallery, the attendees of the trial couldn't conceal their unease. A few whispered to one another, their eyes fixed on Rebecca, as if trying to pierce through her facade of arrogance. A middle-aged woman leaned toward the person beside her, speaking in a hushed tone. "She doesn't look like someone about to be judged. It's like she's treating this as her own press conference." Rebecca heard it, but didn't care. A faint smirk played on her lips, as though the whispered comment only bolstered her confidence. By now, Judge Marcus Grant had settled into his seat. He cast a brief but piercing glance at Rebecca, his gaze sharp enough to cut through her layers of defense. But Rebecca didn't return the look. Instead, she adjusted her hair, a deliberate act of provocation, as if to signal her indifference. When the guard's firm voice rang out, "All rise," the courtroom collectively stood, from the spectators to the legal teams. But Rebecca remained seated, her eyes fixed straight ahead, arms still crossed, chin tilted upward in defiance. The sound of shuffling feet and the respectful silence of the room only served to highlight her blatant disregard. Rebecca's lawyer, standing beside her, bent down and whispered urgently, "Rebecca, stand up. This isn't a joke." She turned to him, her icy blue eyes locking onto his, before letting out a dry laugh. "They won't do anything to me. We both know that." Her words weren't loud, but they were audible enough for those nearby to hear. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Some frowned, others exchanged uneasy glances. As the courtroom fell still again, Rebecca remained motionless. Only when Judge Grant spoke, his voice deep and commanding, did she finally stir. "Miss Carter, in my courtroom, everyone follows the rules. Stand up immediately." For a brief moment, Rebecca hesitated. But rather than rising promptly, she pushed her chair back slowly, standing with an air of reluctant compliance. Her hands rested on her hips, her lips curling into a mocking smile. The sharp clicks of her high heels echoed as she adjusted her stance, clearly designed to draw attention. Now standing, she slouched lazily, her body language screaming that her compliance was purely begrudging. Judge Grant, his face impassive, maintained his unwavering gaze on her, silently delivering a message. "I see exactly who you are." The tension in the room grew heavy. Everyone could feel the undercurrent of conflict brewing between the two figures at the center of it all, an uncompromising judge and a police officer accustomed to privilege. The battle had already begun, requiring no raised voices or dramatic gestures. Rebecca eventually sat back down after a nod from the judge. She crossed her arms and legs, adopting a posture of casual disdain, as if attending a social gathering rather than a solemn court proceeding. What she didn't realize was that her blatant disrespect was only fueling the storm brewing behind the judge's bench. Judge Grant, after sweeping his gaze across the room, calmly adjusted his glasses. His voice, though quiet, carried a razor-sharp edge as he announced, "Now, we will begin." With those words, the trial commenced, not only to determine the actions of Rebecca Carter, but also to test the limits of justice in the face of arrogance and the abuse of power. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the pages turn on Judge Grant's desk. With his usual calm demeanor, he opened the case file before him, his voice steady yet commanding. "Ms. Rebecca Carter, you stand before this court today accused of running a red light, speeding without caution, and nearly causing a pedestrian accident. Your actions resulted in Mr. Edward Lopez, 68, being hospitalized with a wrist injury. Do you wish to contest these charges?" Rebecca, leaning back in her chair, adjusted the collar of her uniform slowly. At the mention of Mr. Lopez's name, she raised an eyebrow, then smirked dismissively. "No need. I just hit the gas a little. Who doesn't? Why make such a big deal out of it?" Her words sent a ripple through the room. Whispers of disapproval spread. A few shook their heads in disbelief, while some exchanged glances of outrage. Rebecca's lawyer, seated beside her, flushed red, tugging at her sleeve urgently. "Rebecca, stop. This isn't the time for jokes." But Rebecca ignored him, her cold gaze fixed on Judge Grant. Judge Grant set his pen down deliberately and slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. His face revealed no obvious emotion, but the gravity in his stare silenced the room instantly. His voice was firm as he spoke. "Ms. Carter, are you aware of the consequences of your actions?" Rebecca laughed dryly, the sound echoing uncomfortably in the stillness. She shrugged, her tone dripping with disdain. "The guy's fine. Don't blow it out of proportion. I don't see why we're all here over something so trivial." Once again, the courtroom erupted in murmurs of discomfort. All eyes turned to Judge Grant, awaiting his reaction. But instead of anger, he maintained his composure. "Trivial," he repeated, his voice lower and each word deliberate, as if to engrave them into the heavy air of the room. "Do you consider injuring an elderly man, sending him to the hospital, and leaving him in pain a trivial matter?" Rather than show remorse, Rebecca tilted her head, her lips curling into a mocking smile. "Yes, trivial. I didn't hit him. He's fine. If we made a big deal out of every little stumble, this court wouldn't have time for anything else." Audible gasps filled the room. A few people shook their heads. Others began whispering more audibly. A young woman near the door leaned toward her companion and murmured, "Does she really feel no guilt? Is this how someone in law enforcement behaves?" Judge Grant took a deep breath, his gaze flickering briefly with disappointment. He flipped through a few pages in the file before looking directly at Rebecca. His voice, now carrying an undeniable weight, resonated through the room. "Ms. Carter, as a police officer, your duty is to protect the public, not to disregard their safety and lives. Your actions were not only a violation of the law, but also a reflection of recklessness and irresponsibility. Do you truly believe you've done nothing wrong?" For the first time, Rebecca straightened her posture, a faint hesitation crossing her face. But she quickly recovered, her voice steady and tinged with sarcasm. "I did what I had to do. If Mr. Lopez hadn't stepped onto the street carelessly, this wouldn't have happened." A loud gasp was heard from the audience. All eyes locked on Rebecca, astonished that she could deliver such a callous response. Judge Grant paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, capturing the indignation on every face. He removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair, his tone quieter but no less authoritative. "Ms. Carter, you're not just standing before the law. You're standing before your own responsibility. If your attitude and behavior go unchecked today, what comes next? Another reckless act? A graver consequence? Perhaps a life lost?" His words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. Rebecca, though her expression remained defiant, faltered in the silence. A subtle flicker of uncertainty betrayed her confidence, a crack so slight yet unmistakable under the sharp gaze of Judge Grant. She didn't realize it yet, but what lay ahead would be a turning point, a moment where her arrogant facade would begin to unravel, piece by piece. A heavy silence enveloped the courtroom as Judge Grant paused midway, his stern gaze fixed on the security guard standing near the door. His voice was calm, yet commanding. "Bring in Mr. Edward Lopez." The rear door of the courtroom creaked open, and an older man stepped inside. Edward Lopez, 68, thin and frail, wore a rumpled shirt, his right arm bandaged and supported by a sling. He didn't glance around, taking slow, deliberate steps, his gait slightly labored. Every eye in the room turned toward him, including Rebecca's. Rebecca, who had been leaning back with an air of confidence, suddenly straightened up. Her eyes darted quickly to Lopez, her lips curling into a faint, forced smile. Yet his presence didn't elicit guilt or fear in her, only irritation. Lopez stopped at the front of the courtroom, facing the judge's bench. Judge Grant nodded slightly, a gesture of respectful acknowledgement. He looked at Lopez with piercing but empathetic eyes before turning his attention to Rebecca. "Miss Carter," Judge Grant's voice dropped, each word carrying weight. "This man, Edward Lopez, is the person you nearly hit. Look at him." Rebecca didn't react immediately. She leaned back in her chair again, casting a fleeting glance at Lopez as if he wasn't worth more than a moment of her attention. "I've said this before," she began, her tone dismissive. "I didn't hit him. People are just overreacting." A few people in the courtroom exhaled audibly, unable to hide their frustration. A young man seated near the back shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Unbelievable. How can she say that with him standing right there?" Lopez remained silent. He stood still, his deep, sorrowful eyes seeming to weigh Rebecca's words carefully. There was no anger, no accusations, only quiet disappointment, which made the atmosphere even more stifling. Judge Grant seized the moment, flipping through the file on his desk before beginning to read aloud. His voice was steady, but each word felt like a sharp blade. "Edward Lopez was walking through a crosswalk legally when Miss Carter accelerated from behind. According to witness testimony, not only did she fail to slow down, but she also honked aggressively, forcing Mr. Lopez to jump out of the way. In doing so, he fell to the ground and was injured." He paused, raising his eyes to meet Rebecca's. "Medical reports confirm that Mr. Lopez suffered a fractured wrist. He underwent surgery and is now in recovery, enduring weeks of pain." Rebecca began to fidget slightly, rubbing her hands together. Her confident demeanor faltered momentarily before she quickly regained composure. "I'm not denying he fell, but it wasn't my fault. If he hadn't been so slow crossing the street, none of this would have happened." Her words sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Several people couldn't hold back, gasping audibly in outrage. Judge Grant placed his pen down and leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Rebecca. "Miss Carter, are you saying that the responsibility lies with an elderly man, walking legally, while you, the driver in control of the vehicle, bear no fault whatsoever? Rebecca opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, unable to form a convincing reply. Instead, she leaned back again, crossing her arms over her chest, feigning indifference. Judge Grant studied her for another moment before turning to Lopez. His tone softened as he asked, "Mr. Lopez, I know this is difficult, but is there anything you'd like to say to the court?" Lopez took a deep breath, his gentle, unassuming eyes showing no trace of resentment. His voice was hoarse but steady, each word clear and deliberate. "I don't want her to face a harsh punishment. I only want her to understand that her actions can destroy lives if she doesn't change. I don't want anyone else to go through what I've endured." His words left the courtroom in silence. Even Rebecca, though she tried to maintain her cold demeanor, couldn't completely mask the flicker of unease crossing her face. Judge Grant nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of empathy for Lopez and sharp disapproval for Rebecca. Turning back to her, his gaze hardened. "Miss Carter, Mr. Lopez's words highlight something you lack: understanding and accountability. This is no longer just about a minor accident. This is about you abusing your privilege and power to shirk responsibility. And in this courtroom, that will not be tolerated." The judge's words rang like a bell, signaling that the clash between justice and arrogance had reached its boiling point. The entire courtroom sank into a heavy silence following Judge Grant's stern words. Rebecca, despite sensing the outraged stares from all directions, refused to back down. She sat upright, her gaze indifferent, her lips curled into a mocking smile. "I don't believe I did anything wrong," she emphasized, her voice carrying a defiant tone. "I know the situation better than anyone else. This is just a misunderstanding blown way out of proportion." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the audience. A middle-aged woman turned to the person beside her, whispering with exasperation, "She's not even remorseful. It's horrifying that an officer could behave like this." Judge Grant maintained his composed demeanor, but his expression grew increasingly severe. Leaning forward, his hands clasped on the bench, his voice resonated through the room, steady but commanding. "Ms. Carter, do you understand that neither your rank nor your badge places you above the law? Your duty is to protect citizens, yet your actions put them in harm's way. If you refuse to take responsibility now, who will when something worse happens?" His words struck like blows against Rebecca's arrogant facade. She bit her lower lip, a fleeting gesture betraying the insecurity she tried to mask. But, almost immediately, she let out a nervous chuckle, attempting to reclaim her confidence. "So, you're saying this is all my fault because I was speeding a little? You're blowing this way out of proportion." Her response froze the room. The spectators shook their heads, a few exhaling audibly in frustration. Even her attorney, seated beside her, raised a hand to his face, clearly wishing to avoid the judge's gaze. Judge Grant paused, as if weighing each word carefully. Then, rising to his full height, he fixed his piercing gaze on Rebecca. "Ms. Carter, this isn't about me blowing things out of proportion. This is about accountability, the consequences of your actions, and the attitude you're displaying. If someone with your privilege refuses to admit fault, what example are you setting for those you are entrusted to protect?" Rebecca fell silent, though her face still strained to maintain an air of defiance. Yet her hands, tightly clenched in her lap, revealed that the judge's words had indeed hit a nerve, however small. Judge Grant continued, his voice steady but weighted with gravity, like the hammer of justice itself. You've heard Mr. Lopez's testimony. He's not demanding severe punishment for you. He only hopes you understand the consequences of your actions. But so far, you've refused to acknowledge any responsibility. This attitude isn't just an insult to Mr. Lopez, but to the very justice you swore to uphold." The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken, Judge Grant's words reverberating beyond Rebecca, touching everyone present. Rebecca shifted uneasily in her chair, for the first time appearing rattled. However, she quickly masked it by crossing her legs and folding her arms across her chest, her gaze attempting to reclaim its rebellious edge. "Fine. If you think I'm wrong, then punish me. But I'm not going to pretend to be sorry for something I didn't do." The murmurs swelled again, louder this time. Rebecca's attorney leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear, but she merely shook her head, refusing to listen. Judge Grant placed his hands on the bench, his sharp gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that seemed to slice through her pretense. His tone was cold and resolute as he spoke. "Very well, Ms. Carter. If you seek unyielding justice, this court will not disappoint you." His words landed like the blow of a gavel in the minds of everyone present. Confronted by a judge unwilling to tolerate arrogance or evade responsibility, Rebecca may not have foreseen the reckoning awaiting her. But one thing was certain. Her complacency was about to come at a high cost. Judge Grant paused for a moment, his piercing gaze directed at Rebecca, before he glanced down and flipped through a few pages in the file before him. The sound of the turning pages was faint, but in the courtroom's heavy silence, it carried a tension as ominous as a brewing storm. After skimming the documents, he raised his head, his deep, resolute voice breaking the stillness. "After considering the circumstances of the case and the defendant's attitude, the court hereby sentences Rebecca Carter to 200 hours of community service at the Los Angeles Veterans Assistance Center." The room fell silent, as though time itself had stopped. Rebecca, who had been lounging comfortably in her chair, shot upright. Her eyes flashed with anger. "You want me to work there? No way!" Her voice rang out, shattering the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. Her attorney immediately reached out, tugging at her arm and whispering urgently, "Rebecca, be quiet. Don't make this worse." But she shrugged his hand off, ignoring his plea. Rising to her feet, she pointed a finger at Judge Grant, her eyes blazing with fury. "You can't force me to do that. I'm not a criminal, and I certainly won't stoop to scrubbing floors or doing menial labor at that place." Her words landed like a slap across the courtroom. Some onlookers gaped, stunned, while others exhaled sharply in disapproval. Rebecca's attitude had transcended arrogance, veering into outright insolence. Judge Grant's expression remained composed, but his tone turned icy as he responded. "Ms. Carter, this is not a suggestion. This is a court order. Should you refuse to comply, I will not hesitate to replace this sentence with a harsher one, potentially including jail time." The words struck Rebecca's pride like a hammer blow. She stood there, her lips pressed tightly together, the fury on her face barely masking a flicker of helplessness. After a moment, she drew a deep breath, forcing a semblance of control, and scoffed. "Fine. If you think making me work there will accomplish anything, go ahead and try." Her gaze was defiant, but something in her voice betrayed a slight uncertainty this time. Judge Grant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned down, signed a stack of papers, and then lifted his head to meet her eyes squarely. "You will report to the center daily, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Your duties will include meal preparation, cleaning, and assisting veterans with daily activities. The center's management will provide weekly progress reports. And remember, if you fail to meet these requirements, we will reconvene here, but by then, you will have no alternative. His voice was steady, but every word etched itself into the silence of the room. Rebecca clenched her fists, her eyes blazing with suppressed rage. Turning to her attorney, she hissed through gritted teeth, "He can't do this. I'll appeal." Judge Grant, as though anticipating her outburst, gave a slight nod. "You have the right to appeal, but let me remind you, not every battle can be won through sheer arrogance." His words hung in the air like a somber echo. The courtroom's collective attention remained fixed on Rebecca, who, at that moment, could only lower herself into her chair, her face flushed with indignation. When Judge Grant lifted his gavel and brought it down sharply, declaring, "Court adjourned," the sound was like a heavy punctuation mark, one that put an end to Rebecca's sense of entitlement. But for her, this was merely the beginning of a lesson she had never imagined she would have to learn. Her attorney hastily gathered his documents while Rebecca sat motionless, her eyes scanning the departing crowd. The stares bore into her, some angry, some disappointed, others pitying, searing the image of her defeat into her memory. Outside the courtroom, the midday sun cast bright rays across the plaza. But for Rebecca, they only illuminated the unease and alienation she was trying so hard to mask. And though she refused to admit it, deep within, Judge Grant's words continued to echo, leaving her with a nagging thought she couldn't shake. Had she truly been wrong? Rebecca stepped out of her car, the morning sun glaring into her tired eyes after a long, aggravating night. In front of her stood the Los Angeles Veteran Support Center, an aging building with white walls that had yellowed over time. The sign on the door read, "A place to rebuild lives," making her smirk bitterly. With a heavy sigh, she adjusted her simple business attire, a style she wasn't accustomed to, and walked inside. The interior of the center was a stark contrast to the opulence she was familiar with. Plain wooden tables were neatly arranged. A group of veterans sat chatting, while others quietly read or gazed out the window. The atmosphere wasn't somber, but carried a calm austerity that felt foreign to Rebecca. A middle-aged woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor approached her. This was Linda, the center's manager. Linda looked Rebecca up and down, unimpressed by her presence. "You must be Carter," Linda said, her voice steady, cold, yet professional. Rebecca nodded, forcing a faint smile. Linda didn't offer warmth. She handed Rebecca an apron and pointed toward the kitchen. "Starting today, you'll be working here. First task, help prepare breakfast in the kitchen." Rebecca took the apron, eyeing it as if it were an alien artifact. She reluctantly made her way to the kitchen, where a few people were busy chopping vegetables, frying eggs, and brewing coffee. The aroma of food filled the room, but to Rebecca it was anything but pleasant. An elderly man with white hair and a kind smile looked up as she entered. "New here, huh?" he asked, his voice gentle but warm. Rebecca gave a slight nod, avoiding eye contact. "I'm Joe. Today's menu is scrambled eggs and toast. Think you can help me set the tables?" She wanted to refuse, to explain that she wasn't here for such tasks, but Judge Grant's words echoed in her mind. "This isn't a suggestion." Swallowing her protest, Rebecca followed his instructions, picking up a tray and methodically setting plates on the tables. She kept her distance from everyone, her eyes wandering as though she wanted to remain untouched by her surroundings. But her silence didn't last. A veteran with a missing arm, replaced by a prosthetic hook, sat down near her. He didn't look at her but stared at his plate, his voice low but firm. "You're new, right? It's obvious. What do you think this place is?" Rebecca looked up, startled by the bluntness of his question. She hesitated, unsure how to respond. The man continued, his tone devoid of malice but filled with raw truth. "We don't need your pity if that's what you're thinking. We fought, we lost, and now we're just trying to live. You don't have to like it here, but at least respect it." His words left Rebecca silent. For reasons she couldn't explain, they stirred a vague sense of shame within her. The day went on with menial tasks, clearing tables, washing dishes, and helping prepare lunch. Rebecca felt every gaze in the center on her, not hostile, but evaluative, as though they were waiting to see how she would react. During a break, Rebecca sat alone in a corner. From her seat, she could see the veterans talking among themselves. Their stories weren't about what they'd lost, but what they hoped to rebuild. A home, steady work, a second chance. A young woman with piercing eyes and a scar running from her cheek to her neck approached Rebecca. She sat down, placing a cup of coffee in front of her, and met her gaze directly. "I'm Maria," she said, her voice soft but confident. "I used to think I didn't need anyone's help until I had nothing left to hold on to." Rebecca didn't know how to respond. Maria offered a faint smile, her eyes seeming to see through the facade Rebecca had constructed. "You don't think you belong here, but maybe you can learn something if you're willing to listen." Maria's words, paired with her penetrating gaze, unsettled Rebecca for the first time. She looked down at her hands, still slightly soapy from washing dishes. For the first time that day, Rebecca didn't feel angry or frustrated. She only felt lost, not with this place, but with herself. When the lunch break began, Rebecca sat at a corner of the table, trying to avoid the gazes of those around her. The plate of food in front of her had gone cold, but she didn't care. Her senses were attuned to the murmured conversations in the room, every story seemingly weaving through the air and finding its way to her ears. Across from her, a middle-aged man with a sturdy build but tired eyes placed his food tray down. He wore an old shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal a long scar running down his forearm. He looked at Rebecca, his gaze not judgmental but observant, as though he was trying to uncover a piece of her true self. "I'm James," he said, his voice deep and hoarse, yet carrying an indescribable steadiness. "You're new here, aren't you?" Rebecca nodded, trying not to reveal her discomfort. James smiled, a smile etched with the marks of time and harsh experiences. "I've been here for a year," he said, his voice light, but with each word carrying a strange weight. "That was when I lost everything." Rebecca couldn't resist her curiosity, even though she didn't want to admit it. She looked at him, her hesitant gaze silently inviting him to continue. "I used to be an infantry soldier," James went on, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as if to dispel some lingering memory. "I spent nearly 10 years fighting in places you probably only know from the news. When I came back, I thought I'd be welcomed as a hero. But no one told me that when the war ends, the real battle begins." James paused, his eyes gazing into the distance as if searching through his memories. "I lost my wife, my home, even myself," he said, his voice trembling slightly but still composed. "I used to think I'd sacrificed everything to protect freedom for people like you, but sometimes I wonder if they remember that freedom comes with responsibility." Those words pierced through Rebecca's mind like a sharp blade. She glanced down at her hands that had once gripped the wheel with arrogant confidence, careless of the consequences. She struggled to find a response, but every word seemed to choke in her throat. James continued, his voice devoid of blame, but filled with stark honesty. When you do something, whether it's small or significant, it leaves a mark. You might not see it right away, but one day it'll come back. You have the choice to decide what that mark will be, a wound or hope. Rebecca remained silent, her eyes fixed on James. In that moment, she no longer saw a veteran sitting before her. She saw herself, a person living without a clear purpose, lost in arrogance and complacency. James picked up his tray and stood. Before leaving, he paused and looked directly at her. "I'm not telling you this story so you'll pity me. I'm telling you so you understand that every one of us is responsible for what we do, and that responsibility can't be ignored, no matter how hard you try." Rebecca watched James as he walked away from the table. His words echoed in her mind, repeating like a lesson she couldn't evade. In that moment, Rebecca's familiar arrogance didn't completely disappear, but it wavered. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she didn't fully understand the world around her, and that she needed to change before it was too late. Lunch ended, and Rebecca returned to her work, but she no longer approached it with the reluctance she had that morning. She began to listen, to observe the people she once looked down upon. In her heart, a question began to take shape. If these people could rise after losing everything, why couldn't she change herself? The days that followed passed slowly, but no longer carried the heavy weight they initially had. Rebecca began to adapt to the rhythm of the center, from preparing meals and cleaning tables to chatting with the veterans. At first, she kept her distance, speaking little and doing just enough to complete her tasks. But gradually, everything around her, the people, their stories, and their genuine smiles, started to seep into her world. One morning, while Rebecca was mopping the kitchen floor, she heard laughter echoing from the dining hall. Curious, she glanced through the open door and saw Joe, the kind-hearted man she had met on her first day, telling a humorous story about his early days in the military. The people around him were laughing heartily, not because the story was particularly funny, but because of the warmth and vibrancy Joe brought to it. Rebecca found herself smiling, a real smile, free of reluctance or sarcasm. That afternoon, she noticed Maria, a young woman with a long scar, struggling with a heavy box of food supplies. Without much thought, Rebecca stepped forward and gently took the box from Maria's hands. "Let me help you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Maria looked at her, a flicker of surprise in her eyes quickly replaced by a grateful smile. "Thank you," Maria replied, her voice gentle but steady. Rebecca didn't expect this small gesture to leave any lasting impression, but it became the first step in breaking down the barriers she had erected between herself and the others. Day by day, Rebecca began to listen more. The stories of those around her were no longer fragmented words, they became weighty lessons. Joe shared about the long, lonely months he spent missing his family during the war. Maria talked about learning to love herself again after both physical and emotional scars. James, who had once irritated Rebecca with his blunt remarks, became someone she sought advice from. One afternoon, while helping distribute meals, Rebecca realized that the things she had once dismissed as mundane, cleaning, serving, or simply offering a smile, held profound significance for the people here. These small acts not only brought comfort, but also conveyed respect and empathy. One day, as she sat alone in the corner of the center's yard, Rebecca looked down at her hands. Hands she had once taken pride in as symbols of strength and power. Now they were slightly calloused from the physical work, but she didn't feel discomfort. Instead, she felt a sense of peace. She remembered her first days at the center, walking in with disdain, convinced she didn't belong. But now, she realized that her power and privilege didn't make her better than the people here. It was her actions, her care, and her ability to listen that truly defined her worth as a person. Rebecca wasn't someone who could completely change in just a few days, but the arrogance that had once been a part of her was slowly being replaced by a humility she hadn't expected. One evening, as the veterans gathered to watch an old movie, Rebecca took the initiative to bring extra drinks and snacks for them. Maria, sitting in the front row, glanced at Rebecca and smiled. "You've changed a lot," Maria said, her eyes filled with gentle admiration. Rebecca, still a bit self-conscious, simply smiled and nodded. "I think I still have a lot to learn," she replied, admitting for the first time a truth she had never dared to face before. That night, as she left the center, Rebecca looked up at the star-filled sky. A strange, yet comforting feeling washed over her, a sense of lightness, as if she had just let go of a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. Rebecca's transformation didn't come from a single moment, but from a series of small experiences, each one gradually erasing her prejudices and sense of entitlement. And while she didn't yet know what she would do after completing her community service, she was certain of one thing: she would never be the person she once was. Rebecca's footsteps echoed through the courthouse hallway, carrying a mix of tension and serenity. The courtroom door creaked open, and she stepped inside, stripped of the arrogance she had worn like armor on her first day. Instead, she appeared in simple attire, her face devoid of makeup, and her eyes steady yet softened. In the courtroom, eyes turned toward her, not with the disdain or judgment of before, but with curiosity and hope. A few observers noticed a profound shift in her demeanor. Rebecca no longer walked with the air of entitlement, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned something profound. Judge Marcus Grant was already seated, his presence commanding behind the bench. His sharp gaze was no longer heavy with disdain, but carried a tempered edge. As Rebecca stood before the defendant's table, he gave a slight nod, signaling the start of the proceedings. Judge Grant began. "Ms. Carter, you have completed 200 hours of community service at the Veteran Support Center. Today, the court convenes to review your progress and determine whether the sentence has fulfilled its purpose. Do you have anything you wish to say?" Rebecca drew a deep breath. Her eyes didn't waver. They met the judge's with a steady gaze. When she spoke, her voice lacked its former arrogance or defiance. Instead, it carried humility and sincerity. "Your Honor, when I first walked into the center, I thought of it as nothing more than a punishment. I didn't believe I would learn anything from it, but the people I met there, they taught me more than I could have imagined, about sacrifice, patience, and responsibility." She paused, her eyes blinking rapidly as though to hold back emotion before continuing. "They don't have privilege or power, but they possess something I had lost long ago: compassion. I realized that my privilege didn't make me better. It blinded me. I was wrong. Wrong to think I wasn't accountable, and wrong to look down on others." The room fell into a hushed silence. Rebecca's words weren't just an apology. They were a genuine confession that resonated deeply with those present. Judge Grant remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Rebecca. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but weighty. "Ms. Carter, I have encountered many individuals in this courtroom. Some come here to evade responsibility. Others, like you, initially fail to see the need for change. But very few, after serving their sentence, can stand before me and speak as you just did." He clasped his hands together on the bench before continuing. "A true expression of gratitude, as I've often said, is shown through action. What you've learned should not end with words. It must guide how you live and work from this day forward." Rebecca nodded, her eyes reflecting a newfound resolve. Before the proceedings concluded, Rebecca turned to Mr. Edward Lopez, the man she had nearly harmed in the incident that brought her here, the man whose disappointment had shaken her during her first trial. "Mr. Lopez," Rebecca began, her voice trembling slightly but firm with determination, "I want to apologize for what I did, and I thank you for not seeking vengeance, but instead for hoping that I would understand the consequences of my actions. I promise I won't forget this lesson." Mr. Lopez, seated among the spectators, offered her a gentle smile. He nodded, his eyes no longer filled with disappointment, but with quiet faith. Judge Grant struck the gavel, signaling the end of the session. "Ms. Carter, the court acknowledges that you have fulfilled your sentence. I hope that, from now on, every action you take reflects the lessons you've learned." Rebecca bowed her head in gratitude, not out of obligation, but with genuine thankfulness. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the morning sunlight touched her face. For the first time in years, she felt unburdened, as if invisible weights had been lifted from her shoulders. She knew her journey wasn't over, that the lessons she had learned at the center weren't confined to 200 hours of service, but would stay with her for life. And now, she was ready to face the world, not with arrogance, but with the humility and responsibility she had rediscovered. Rebecca hesitated in front of the courtroom door, her gaze wavering as she glanced toward Mr. Edward Lopez, who sat quietly in the gallery. Mr. Lopez seemed oblivious to her glance, his hand gently adjusting the sling on his injured arm. His face no longer bore the exhaustion it had when they first met, but his peculiar calmness now made Rebecca feel self-conscious. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and approached him. Her soft footsteps echoed, drawing Mr. Lopez's gaze upward. When their eyes met, Rebecca stopped, her eyes brimming with the guilt she had long hidden. "Mr. Lopez," she began, her voice trembling but sincere, "I'm so sorry for what happened. I never intended to hurt you." She bowed her head deeply, as though to express a remorse that words could never fully capture. In that moment, the arrogance that had once defined her was entirely gone. She was no longer a woman evading accountability, but someone standing before the consequences of her actions with genuine humility. Mr. Lopez remained silent for a moment. His gaze was gentle, devoid of the disappointment Rebecca had seen before. All that remained was profound empathy. He smiled softly and spoke in a calm yet firm voice. "I don't need an apology, Miss Carter. I just need you to understand." Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes blinking back emotion as she absorbed his words. "I do understand," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I understand that my actions could have led to far worse consequences, and I understand that I need to take responsibility, not just to you, but to everyone around me." Mr. Lopez nodded, his expression showing a trace of relief. "If you truly understand, then I trust you'll never let something like this happen again. Sometimes, recognizing our mistakes is the first step to becoming a better version of ourselves." A sense of relief washed over Rebecca, a feeling she hadn't experienced before. She hadn't expected such a simple apology to bring such clarity, a release from the guilt and pride she had clung to. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Mr. Lopez stood, his injured arm securely supported in the sling. Before leaving, he looked directly at Rebecca, as if to emphasize one final point. "You're a strong person, Miss Carter, but real strength doesn't come from power or status. It lies in how you use them to make things better." His words served as a final reminder, etched deeply into Rebecca's mind. As Mr. Lopez walked out of the courtroom, Rebecca remained rooted to the spot, watching his figure disappear through the door. A fleeting sense of emptiness passed over her, but it was also an invitation to begin anew. Outside the courthouse, the midday sun streamed down onto the steps where the attendees had begun to disperse. Rebecca stepped out slowly, her movements lighter than they had been before. She spotted Mr. Lopez standing nearby, chatting with a few people, his smile brighter than she had ever seen. Though she knew she couldn't change the past, Rebecca realized that the future was still hers, a chance to start over, to turn what she had learned into meaningful actions, as Judge Grant had advised. That apology wasn't just for Mr. Lopez, it was a promise to herself, a vow to become someone better, more reliable, and humbler. Rebecca slowly descended the courthouse steps, a place she once entered with an air of arrogance and a conviction that she could evade any accountability. But this time, she walked away with a completely different mindset. Her face no longer held its rigid expression, and her eyes no longer glimmered with defensiveness. Instead, she looked like someone who had emerged from a long, grueling inner battle, not to win, but to rediscover herself. Her car was parked nearby, but Rebecca didn't hurry toward it. She paused, tilting her head back to gaze at the clear blue sky. A gentle breeze swept by, carrying a soothing sensation akin to the fresh start she now felt within. 2 days later, Rebecca stood before the familiar doors of the Los Angeles Veterans Support Center. This time, there was no heavy burden as she stepped inside, only an inexplicable sense of peace. A few veterans recognized her immediately. Joe, the ever-smiling and kind-hearted man, approached her with a look of surprise. "Rebecca, I thought you completed your community service," he said, smiling warmly but with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Rebecca nodded, her smile gentle. "I did, but I wanted to come back. This time, not because I have to, but because I truly want to help." Joe said nothing more, merely giving her a soft pat on the shoulder, a silent gesture of encouragement. Rebecca started again with the familiar tasks, preparing meals, cleaning, and chatting with the veterans. But this time, these actions no longer felt like a burden. They became a way for her to connect with the people who had profoundly changed her life. One afternoon, as she was sorting through donation boxes, Maria, a woman with a long scar down her cheek, came to stand beside her. "You really came back," Maria said, her tone a mix of surprise and quiet joy. "I made a promise to myself," Rebecca replied, her voice calm yet resolute. "If they can rebuild their lives despite everything they've lost, then I have no excuse not to try." As time passed, helping at the center became an integral part of Rebecca's life. She not only took on daily tasks but also took the initiative to organize fundraisers, seek sponsorships, and connect the center with the broader community. Rebecca's story began to spread, becoming a living testament to the power of transformation and compassion. She was no longer seen as the arrogant police officer once criticized for her abuse of authority, but as a symbol of redemption and the ability to rebuild a life. Rebecca never forgot the harsh early days at the center. James's blunt words, Maria's steadfast yet gentle gaze, and, most of all, Mr. Lopez's forgiving smile. Those lessons didn't just reshape her view of the world, they reshaped her. Rebecca's journey reminds us that privilege does not exempt us from responsibility. Change doesn't come from authority or force, but from empathy, understanding, and sincere action. Only when we are willing to listen and confront our mistakes can we create meaningful change, not just for ourselves but for the world around us. With a lighter heart and a clear purpose, Rebecca walked the new path she had chosen, not with a badge on her chest but with humility and a determination to live more responsibly each day. Rebecca's story is not just one of atonement. It's a powerful testament to the possibility of change if we dare to face our mistakes and open our hearts to life's lessons. From an arrogant and lost woman, she learned the value of accountability, humility, and the strength of compassion. If you were in Rebecca's position, would you have the courage to change and make amends? How do you think a small act can create a big difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved or inspired you, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more meaningful content. We're here to share stories that make you reflect and feel more deeply about life.